C.S. Lewis is one of the most prolific writers from the past 100 years. You may know him from his fantasy series, The Chronicles of Narnia, or perhaps from his religious writings such as Mere Christianity. Maybe you've run into his academic writings while researching the medieval period. But it was none of these writings that really caught my eye as much as his Space Trilogy, because there's a lot of play in the series that, when compared to historical context, paints a very interesting picture of the man himself. Someone who is vehemently against colonialism but reveres the authority of the crown. Someone who includes a religious allegory in the same series as a political thriller. Someone who criticizes discrimination with great conviction but also has some very specific opinions on women. Someone who manages to write a story about aliens and Christianity and Arthurian legend all at once, while still building a strong and vivid sense of setting and place. Today I hope to explore Lewis's Space Trilogy, specifically what the characters, plot, and subtext of his work says about Lewis's politics and Lewis as a person. We're going to be looking at some ideas such as white colonialism, white supremacy, fascism, eugenics, race science, social Darwinism. I know this sounds like a lot, and it is, but all these ideas show up in his writing and intersect in quite an interesting way. Before we get started in full, however, there are a few things I need to take care of. First, I'm going to need to give some content warnings. Because of some of the themes I'm focusing on, I'm going to be touching on a lot of sensitive topics, including but not limited to genocide, racism, misogyny, ableism, and fascism. In addition to covering sensitive topics, I'm also going to be using some terminology, and to make sure that we're all on the same page here, I'm going to sort of rapid fire some definitions so that when I say, for example, colonialism, you know what I mean by that. Colonialism. Now, colonialism generally refers to the act of colonization, which involves the occupation of a territory and gaining political control over it, usually to exploit the territory economically. This in itself isn't an ideology. That being said, there is an ideology that comes along with it. You know that saying, to make an omelet, you're gonna have to break a few eggs? Well, colonialist ideology heavily relies on enforcing the three following ideas. 1, there is in fact an omelet being made. 2, the omelet is not only good and natural, but necessary and inevitable. And 3, because of this, the breaking of any and all eggs is completely justifiable regardless of any possible ethical or moral concerns. This ideology greatly informed the expansion of the British Empire during the 20th century. Later on, I'm going to be referencing the 1899 poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled A White Man's Burden as a sort of point of reference for colonialist ideology. This is for 2 reasons. Firstly, Lewis himself references the poem briefly at the beginning of Out of the Silent Planet, and it's through that reference that I picked up on a lot of what informed this essay. Second, it's generally a good summary of all the aspects of colonialism and colonialist ideology, specifically with regard to the British Empire in the late 20th century. Transhumanism. Transhumanism refers to the idea that humanity as a species can and will evolve past its current mental and physical capabilities. This is often associated with a lot of sci-fi and dystopian fiction. If you've ever seen a movie where characters get body mods like robot arms or a gun for a hand, that's one side of transhumanism. In a more practical sense, you also have folks like Elon Musk wanting to cure autism by putting a chip in people's brain to do things. Real-world application of transhumanism can sometimes be associated with some pretty icky stuff like eugenics and ethnic cleansing. This isn't always the case, but it does tend to be an issue, and this specific version of transhumanism does actually come up multiple times throughout the series. Fascism. This is a bit of a complicated one to define. It's really easy to look at Hitler and Mussolini and say, yeah, they were definitely fascist. But beyond that, it can be a little bit tricky to differentiate fascism from totalitarianism. For example, Hitler was both fascist and totalitarian, but Stalin was totalitarian, but not fascist. What's the difference? For this video, I will be focusing on fascism as discussed in Umberto Eco's article, Fascism. Eco identifies 14 key attributes that often lead into fascism. He does clarify that some of these attributes can be contradictory and not all of them do have to be present for something to be fascism, but as he puts it, it is enough for one of them to be present to allow fascism to coagulate around it. We'll look at some of these aspects in a little bit more detail later, but the general through line in all of them is about power, nationalism, and a general shift in the way that the affected nation perceives the world around them. Okay, that was kind of a lot, but I think we're ready to actually get into the main part of the video. So let's look at some Lewis, shall we? Out of the Silent Planet, published in 1938, is the first book in the Space Trilogy, which follows the adventures of a young philologist by the name of Ransom as he is kidnapped by some not-so-nice academics and is brought to the planet Malacandra, or as it's better known by us normies, Mars. There's a lot of fun world building and philosophical discussion in this novel, but I think what most stands out to me is Ransom's character arc. Ransom goes through a lot of change and growth throughout the novel, but most central to the narrative is the way he gradually deconstructs his colonialist ideology. At the beginning of the book, Ransom is about what you would expect for a British guy in the 1930s. He's not a complete scoundrel, but he doesn't seem to be all that concerned when he hears captors talk about some of their plans for the planet. Once in Malacandra, Ransom makes an escape from his captors, where he has the great fortune of meeting a seal-like creature named Hyoi. It is with Hyoi that Ransom begins to develop a basic understanding of Old Solar, which is the language that is spoken on Malacandra, and Hyoi brings Ransom back home with him, and Ransom is introduced to the rest of Hyoi's people, known as the Hrassa, and it's here that we get a better understanding of both Malacandra and also of Ransom. Malacandra, as Ransom learns during his time with the Hrassa, is composed of a few different types of creatures. There are non-intelligent creatures like the large sea monster called the Hnarka. These creatures are akin to animals on Earth. Then there are Hanau. These things are the intelligent physical beings that are capable of speech. This includes both humans and the Hrassa, as well as the tall feathered humanoids known as the Saroni, and the smaller frog-like people known as the Fifiltridi. Finally, there are the Eldios, which are spiritual beings that don't really have a physical form in the same sense as any Hanau. They don't have bodies, can't be seen or touched, but they're always there. And sometimes when you see something that may well be a trick of the light or hear the faintest whisper that when you truly think about it doesn't sound like a voice at all, you just might be in the presence of an Eldil. We'll talk about the Eldila in a moment, but first I really want to focus on the Hnau, specifically Ransom's experience with them. When he first hears word that there are 3 different species of people, his first thought is to try and figure out which people are the dominant species. The Hrassa have great skill with language, history, and poetry, as well as a penchant for hunting. Ransom, being a philologist, immediately identifies strongly with this and assumes that Hrassa are the dominant species, with the Saroni and Fifiltridi answering to them. However, as he continues to ask questions about the world, he is very frustrated to find that there is a lot that the Hrassa don't know, but what they are certain to say is that the Saroni would know. After this, Ransom is certain that the Saroni are the dominant species. After all, they seem to have extreme knowledge of the world beyond the Hrassa, and knowledge is power, right? Surely the Saroni would use their superior intellect to rule over the other now. And so he asks the Hrassa this, if the Saroni use their superior knowledge to make the Hrassa do anything, but the Hrassa don't quite understand. Ransom makes more discoveries of what the Hrassa don't seem to be able to understand. He asks the Hrassa about war, if there has ever been any sort of conflict between the peoples due to lack of resources.
Did Cerrone and Harassa and Fifeltriggy ever go out like this with weapons against each other, he asks. What for? asked Hioi. It was difficult to explain. If both wanted one thing and neither would give it, said Ransom, would the other at last come with force? Would they say, give it, or we will kill you? What sort of thing? Well, food, perhaps. If the other now wanted food, why should we not give it to them? We often do. The conversation between the two continues as Ransom is extremely distressed when he finds out that a cross rarely has more than one offspring in its lifetime, because, again, the idea of population growth being an inherent good is somewhat societal. Ransom finally starts to be able to come to terms with the lack of dominant species on Malacandra after meeting with a Sorin by the name of Agre. Agre is to guide Ransom to meet with the Oyorsa of Malacandra, which is like the head Aildil almost, a sort of guardian spirit of the planet. When Ransom begins to ask Agre more about what the Oyorsa really is, he explains that the Oyorsa is what rules over all of Hanau. Oyorsa does not die, said the Sorin, and he does not breed. He is the one of his kind who was put into Malacandra to rule it when Malacandra was made. His body is not like ours, nor yours. It is hard to see and light goes through it. Once Ransom gets a better idea about what the Oyorsa is, he finally begins to understand. There is no dominant species on Malacandra because there doesn't need to be. Each people has their own part to play and their own area of expertise. The Harassa are poets and hunters. The Cerrone are historians and shepherds. The Fifeltriggy are artisans and miners. There is no people that is more advanced or more primitive than the other, and there is no disdain between any of the species, only respect and admiration. No one feels that they owe anyone anything, nor that they are owed anything. Everything is done in the will of the Oyorsa, who is under the command of Maldalil, which is the name that the Malacandrans use for God. It's a very idealistic way of living. Ransom tries to explain to the Malacandrans again and again why Earth is so different. There's this idea of being bent. It's linked to the Christian idea of sin being universal. In practice, it's this idea that humanity is inherently selfish and self-serving. Seeing Ransom try to explain to the Malacandrans things like war, violence, colonization, emphasizes the fact that while these things are societal norms, they're not exactly natural. Every time Ransom tells the Malacandrans about the way things are back home, it always ends with them asking him why. And the only sufficient answer is because they have been bent. In this way, Ransom is forced to come to the terms with the fact that colonialism is not natural. That is often the argument in favor of it, especially at the time that this novel was written. This argument is often paired with race science, eugenics, and social Darwinism. To be self-serving is natural. Therefore, it is not only acceptable, but necessary for the white men to subjugate other people. Colonialism is a form of evolution, of advancing the human race. Therefore, any suffering is justifiable. Additionally, to be against colonialism is to be against the so-called future of the human race. This comes up in Kipling's poems. He warns against naysayers quite often, both on the side of the colonizers and the colonized. He frames any opposition to the colonization as a result of misunderstanding and lack of proper education. And at one point he alludes to the story of the Exodus in a very concerning way. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of hosts ye humor us slowly toward the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night? Kipling implicitly compares the white colonizer to God and the colonized to the ancient Israelites being ungrateful for being liberated from slavery. For Kipling, to be colonized is to be liberated from a so-called primitive lifestyle and supposed lack of society and civilization. And the necessary way to enforce this is hierarchy and the social Darwinist idea that the selfishness of man is a necessary trait for survival, regardless of any sort of ethics or morality. In contrast, Lewis presents a world in which two things are true. A person does not have to be selfish to survive, and a society does not have to have a hierarchy to survive. The only hierarchy that is beneficial is one with God at the top and everyone else directly working in his divine will. Now, we are going to get into Lewis's views on social hierarchy a little bit later because it will come clear. He does support gender hierarchy when it comes to gender and politics, But the point here is that a supposedly primitive society is not lesser than. In some of his nonfiction, Lewis writes a lot about this idea of chronological snobbery. Essentially, it's a logical fallacy that supposes that society is more advanced today than it was a couple hundred years ago, and therefore, people in modern day society must be more intelligent. For Lewis, modernity may feel more intelligent because of differences in ethical norms and technologies. However, this is all limited to our own experience, our horizons of expectations, if you will. We may feel as if people in the Middle Ages were stupid because they did not believe in germ theory, but the truth is that doesn't make them less intelligent or less good. They just lived in a different society with different baselines of education, technology, and morality. They were just using what information they had about the world to inform how they interacted with it, and that's all that anyone can do. So not only is a supposed primitive society not inherently lesser than, it also can be more ethically sound when the society is organized in a way that recognizes the sovereignty of God. At the end of the novel, Ransom's captors return and try to fool the Malacandrons into letting them do as they please. Devine hopes to plunder Malacandra for all of its resources. Weston wishes to kill the Malacandrons and move humanities to settle there on Mars for the preservation of the human race. He talks a lot about social Darwinism and preservation of humanity, and oh my god, he's actually a Nazi? Like, he's actually a Nazi. I'm not making this up. The Oyarsa rebukes Weston and Devine and considers killing them, but because of Ransom's willingness to cooperate and submit to the Oyarsa's authority, Ransom is able to talk with Oyarsa and come up with a deal, where the Oyarsa sets up a ship to take them home with only enough air, fuel, and supplies for a direct trip back. If they don't make it back in time, the ship will disintegrate with them inside. In the end, the Oyarsa tells Ransom, "You are guilty of no evil, Ransom of Thilkandra, except a little fearfulness. For that, the journey you go on is your pain and perhaps your cure, for you must be either mad or brave before it is ended."
Perelandra was written as a sequel to Out of the Silent Planet in 1943, and while it does take place in the same universe following the same main character, it is quite different tonally from the first book. While Lewis is generally careful to emphasize the fact that he doesn't write pure allegory, there are certainly a lot more biblical parallels in this book in comparison to the first one. Also, the prose is a bit more purple, and toward the end of the book, he almost falls into the apocalyptic style of the Book of the Revelation. This book is also far less straightforward about its politics. Instead of taking a strong political stance, it depicts a vision of paradise and the struggle to keep it from being corrupted by evil. But there is still something significant that we can take away from this book that plays into some of the ideas in the rest of the trilogy, and that is Lewis's perspective on transhumanism. As mentioned in the introduction to this video, this is often linked to some sort of physical or mental evolution, but in Perelandra, Lewis offers an alternative. Because while Perelandra is a story about paradise and jeopardy, it also is the story of a man transcending his humanity, not through physical means, but through a spiritual and moral development. Ransom is called to travel in a sort of coffin-shaped spaceship into the planet of Perelandra, known to us as Venus. He is told that he must fulfill some sort of purpose, though it is kept from him exactly what this purpose is. Part of his whole trial is that he must find out what he is called to do before seeing it through. When he arrives, he finds a world that is wonderfully strange. It's covered in this foamy green ocean, and there's islands of soft grass that move and ripple with the waves. And after some time alone, Ransom meets the other inhabitant of the planet, a mysterious green woman known as the Lady. However, this paradise is soon threatened as Weston, one of the unsavory figures from the previous book, shows up on the planet and then promptly dies. But after a bit, he shows up again. However, he's not Weston this time, not really. He's worse somehow. Something's wrong. After a while, it becomes clear that Weston, the real Weston, is long gone. And whatever this is using his body to try and tempt the Green Woman into disobeying Maldalil's commands, and in doing so, corrupt and destroy Perelandra once and for all. Ransom realizes that the only thing he can do to protect this world is to destroy the unman, as he calls Weston, altogether.
This leads into an intense physical altercation that lasts hours, and they roll through islands, dive through the sea, grapple across caves, and finally Ransom sends the unmanned into the fiery depths of the Paralundran underground. By the time he returns to Earth, Ransom is a very different man. We get an outside perspective of him. The narrator who has recorded the story as told to him by Ransom mentions that when Ransom returns, he looks younger and is much more muscular. He's free from injuries, save for an injury on the heel that was given to him by the unmanned. For the record, this is all extremely Christian. Lewis's faith is a running theme in all of his fiction, and often is presented as a solution to a lot of political issues. In book 1, for example, the thing that made Malacandran society better was not just the equality among peoples, but also their mutual devotion of Maldilil. And here, the proposed alternative to transhumanism is quite similar. We don't need to re-engineer the human race. If we follow in God's will, fulfill our purpose we are called to, and overcome the spiritual weaknesses inherent to being human, we will be transformed in our own way. This is especially interesting when considering the way transhumanism is presented in That Hideous Strength, where, as will be seen later, some of the characters quite literally outline a plan for the total cleansing of the human race, down to one super intelligence that is not reliant on any sort of organic life. In contrast, Ransom's transformation is not reliant on the subjugation of others, and is instead reliant on his ability to prevent evil from corrupting what is good. The next step for humanity is not eugenics or ethnic cleansing, it's spiritual growth and enlightenment. It's destroying evil before it can fester and corrupt our minds and hearts. And we'll see this idea repeated again in the next book, but it will be less spiritual and far more political. But before we get into that, I want to talk about another very interesting theme in this book: gender. Now, I know what you're thinking. Gender? I hardly know her. Two main points where Lewis's view of gender really makes itself present. The first is in the depiction of the lady herself. One thing that I noticed when preparing this essay is that she almost falls into the born sexy yesterday archetype. I say almost because some of the most obviously problematic aspects of this archetype are fortunately not present. The lady is not an object of Ransom's desire. He mentions that even though she's naked and she is beautiful, he doesn't really feel particularly attracted to her. It's a bit reminiscent of how in Genesis 3:25, Adam and Eve are naked but not really aware of it or feeling any sort of shame about it. However, the lady definitely does have that odd sort of innocence that is inherent to the trope. She does act a bit childlike, and while we do see her learn and gain wisdom, or get older as she calls it, she still feels a bit infantilized. And with how her dialogue is written, and as well as how Ransom and the unmanned talk about her when she's not there. It's not inherently problematic, I don't think. It's just interesting to note, as this is the first woman we meet in the entire series. Also, there's this odd bit where the unmanned tries to tempt the lady by putting on her a cape with feathers and showing her a mirror because, of course, women love clothes and being pretty, and that's how you tempt a woman into sin. It's a scene where the temptation is weirdly gendered and really enforces this feeling that the lady is not supposed to be anything other than a parallel to Eve. Ransom isn't able to see himself in this temptation. Instead, he worries because he knows how women be shopping, and in my opinion, it really weakens the dynamic between Ransom and the lady. In contrast to this, we have the depiction of the Oyarsa at the end of the novel. This is the part of the book that takes on the literary style of the Book of Revelation. Ransom talks about how when he sees the Oyarsa of Mars and the one of Venus, he is suddenly able to perceive the concept of gender in a completely new way. And it's especially interesting given how the definition of what gender is has sort of shifted since the book was published. At all events, what Ransom saw at that moment was the real meaning of gender. Everyone must sometimes have wondered why, in nearly all tongues, certain inanimate objects are masculine and others feminine. What is masculine about a mountain, or feminine about certain trees? Ransom has cured me of believing that this is purely a morphological phenomenon, depending on the form of the word. Still less is gender an imaginative extension of sex. Our ancestors did not make mountains masculine because they projected male characteristics into them. The real process is the reverse. Gender is a reality, and a more fundamental reality than sex. Sex is, in fact, merely the adaptation to organic life of a fundamental polarity which divides all created beings. Female sex is simply one of the things that have feminine gender. There are many others, and masculine and feminine meet us on planes of reality where male and female would simply be meaningless. Masculine is not attenuated male, nor feminine attenuated female. On the contrary, the male and female of organic creatures are rather faint and blurred reflections of masculine and feminine. Their reproductive functions, their differences in strength and size, partially exhibit, but partially also confuse and misrepresent the real polarity. All this Ransom saw, as it were, with his own eyes. The two white creatures were sexless, but he of Malacandra was masculine, not male, and she of Paralandra was feminine, not female. This is an incredible and beautiful description of such a complicated part of being alive. The idea that not only are sex and gender separate, but that gender is more concrete, that sex is a mere reflection of gender, is such an interesting perspective. And the way that he really writes this in such a beautiful way is just so impressive to me. Even if I'm not entirely sure how I feel about it, I'm absolutely flabbergasted. It's such a beautiful section. There's really not much I can add to all this other than I really want you to keep this in mind as we start to talk about book 3, because while I have a lot to say about it, I'm going to want to revisit the gender stuff because boy howdy does it come up. Even though each book in this trilogy is very distinct from one another, I don't think I would be alone in saying that That Hideous Strength kind of goes off the rails. In a good way, but off the rails nonetheless. Whereas Out of the Silent Planet is a fairly straightforward narrative, Paralandra is very purpley with more allegorical and even prophetic feel. And while Lewis refers to That Hideous Strength as a modern fairy tale for grown-ups, the majority of the text takes on the structure and tone of a political thriller. It's very heavy on dialogue, but while people do say a lot of words, it's very rare that anyone actually says anything that amounts to anything. It's chock full of empty speech and intentionally confusing rhetoric. I think we're done doing whatever that was. We don't get to see what Ransom is up to right away in this book. We instead begin by meeting a young married couple by the names of Jane and Mark Studdick. They are both heavily involved in academia. Jane is working on a doctorate thesis about John Donne, and Mark works for the Bracton College at the fictional University of Edgestowe. The book follows both characters as they find themselves being drawn into distinctly different circles of people. Jane becomes a part of a community of people, including Ransom, who are willing to listen to and help her with some trouble she has regarding prophetic dreams. In contrast, Mark does his best to schmooze his way up the ranks of... There's a lot to unpack in this book. It's very long, for one, and we also get a very interesting intersection of Christianity, aliens, and Arthurian mythology, which is simultaneously the most ridiculous thing ever and very on brand for Lewis. There's also the ending, which is extremely fast-paced in comparison to the rest of the book and also very violent. It's not that I have a problem with violence, I just was not expecting to read about 3 neo-Nazis attempting to behead each other and then a 4th neo-Nazi coming in and lighting himself on fire. So, in lieu of doing a full summary and analysis of this absolute unit of a book, I'm going to be looking specifically at the aforementioned fascist organization and neo-Nazis. The National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE, is an organization of intellectuals who wish to improve the world that they live in by seizing control of societal power structures in order to, as they claim, preserve the human race. I want to focus on 2 things about NICE. Firstly, I want to explain my claim that they are in fact fascist, and then secondly, I want to talk about why this is significant in the greater context of the series and also what it all tells us about Lewis as a person. NICE is fascist. This is not up for debate. This is a fact. At the beginning of the video, I talked a bit about how fascism is a lot easier to identify than it is to define, so we're going to go back to some of Eco's 14 key aspects of fascism and see how they relate to NICE. One thing that really stood out to me while comparing Nice with Eco's writings, though, is the difference in focus on who is involved. Eco primarily focuses on the common man. In his description, they are most vulnerable to fascist propaganda, or at the very least, most distinctly identifiable as products of it. In that hideous strength, there is a far greater focus on the weaknesses found in the world of academia. Take this conversation between Miss Hardcastle and Mark Suddock, for example. Why, you fool, it's the educated readers who can be gulled. All the difficulty comes with the others. When did you meet a workman who believes the papers? He takes it for granted that they're all propaganda and skips the leading articles. He buys his paper for the football results in the lower paragraphs about girls falling over windows and corpses found in Mayfair flats. He is our problem. We have to recondition him. But the educated public, the people who read the highbrow weeklies, don't need reconditioning. They're all right already. They'll believe anything. As one of the class you mentioned, I just don't believe it. Good Lord, where are your eyes? Look at what the weeklies have got away with. Look at a weekly question. There's a paper for you. When the basic English came in simply as the invention of a free-thinking Cambridge Don, nothing was too good for it. As soon as it was taken up by a Tory Prime Minister, it became a menace to the purity of our language, and wasn't the monarchy an expensive absurdity for 10 years? And then when the Duke of Windsor abdicated, didn't the question go on monarchist and legitimatist for about a fortnight? Did they drop a single reader? Don't you see that the educated reader can't stop reading the highbrow weeklies, whatever they do? He can't. He's been conditioned. Aside from this differing focus, there are some significant parallels between Nice and Eco's aspects of fascism. Third in the list of Eco's aspects is the idea of action for action's sake. He writes, "Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation." The scene I just read out begins with Miss Hardcastle, the one who was doing most of the talking, speaking about this very thing. There you go again. You grumble about being given nothing to do, and as soon as I suggest a bit of real work, you expect to have the whole plan of the campaign told to you before you do it. It doesn't make sense. That's not the way to get on here. The great thing is to do what you're told. If you turn out to be any good, you'll soon understand what's going on, but you've got to begin by doing the work. You don't seem to realize what we are. We are an army. And this is very effective. Mark doesn't really understand what he's doing until it's too late. He's been strong-armed out of thinking and into action and compliance. This idea of acting first and asking questions and understanding why later is how they get Mark to put his moral compass aside. They have him writing propaganda pieces and spreading disinformation through the media. But because his thinking gets in the way of what his employers think about him, he turns his brain off for the sake of his career. Another one of Eco's aspects of fascism that is very prevalent in Nice is the extreme attitude against disagreement. Eco states, "No syncretistic faith can withstand analytical criticism. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. For fascism, disagreement is treason." When Mark defiantly tells Miss Hardcastle at the end of their conversation that he wants to be honest and he has no interest in journalism, he wants to write with integrity, Miss Hardcastle has a very interesting response. "Very well. All you do is help ruin this whole country and perhaps the whole human race, besides dishing out your own career." And again, Miss Hardcastle's rhetoric is very convincing for Mark. The scene continues. The confidential tone in which she had been speaking up till now had disappeared, and there was a threatening finality in her voice. The citizen and the honest man, which had been awakened in Mark by the conversation, quailed a little. His other and far stronger self, the self that was anxious at all costs not to be placed among the outsiders, leaped up, fully alarmed. Mark does make a last-ditch effort to resign after this, but really truly his path is well set by now. He's too much of a people pleaser. He's a respectable man when he's surrounded by respectable people. But when he's around people who expect him to put aside his morals in order to get things done, he complies. There are other aspects of fascism that Nice displays, but I want to bring up just one more. The idea of disagreement being treason leads right into this one. Besides, disagreement is a sign of diversity. Fascism grows up and seeks for consensus by exploiting and exacerbating the natural fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or a prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, fascism is racist by definition. This next bit is extremely disturbing, but I think it's also important because it truly strips Nice down to its basic principles and intentions. Anything that comes out of Nice is inherently tied to the following. Man has got to take charge of man. That means, remember, that some men have got to take charge of the rest, which is another reason for cashing in on it as soon as one can. You and I want to be the people who do the taking charge, not the ones who are taken charge of. Quite. What sort of thing do you have in mind? Quite simple things at first. Sterilization. Oops. Quite simple and obvious things at first. Sterilization of the unfit, liquidation of backwards races. We don't want any dead weights. Selective breeding. Then real education, including prenatal education. By real education, I mean on that has no take it or leave it nonsense. A real education makes the patient what it wants infallibly, whatever he or his parents try to do about it. Of course, it'll have to be mainly psychological at first, but we'll get on. So, we've confirmed with specific examples that Nice is indeed fascist. So what? Well, for one, I think that the historical context of this novel is of particular interest here. That Hideous Strength was first published in 1945, but the preface to the book, which was written after it was completed, is dated as 1943, which means this book was written before the end of the Second World War. In the preface, Lewis states that the story takes place vaguely after the war, so this book is about a post-war society written by someone during the war. Lewis's vision of post-war England is one where Germany lost, but fascist ideology is still alive and well, and is being circulated throughout without much notice or alarm. It's very easy to think from our time that fascism was clear-cut and associated solely with the Axis powers. But Lewis's work proves that concern over fascist ideology was always more than just fear of Nazi Germany overtaking Europe. There was also the fact that Hitler was able to come to power in the first place. If that could happen in Germany that quickly and that intensely, who's to say it wouldn't happen again? If the Nazis were able to completely overtake the German scientific community and eliminate and replace any forms of research as they saw fit, couldn't that happen anywhere? And if this overthrow, this coup, were to happen in the academic world before it did the political, in a country built for bureaucratic dysfunction and gridlock, would anyone even notice before it was too late? When it comes to Lewis's politics, it's very easy to oversimplify. Lewis was a Christian and largely believed that God was the answer to just about every problem. Due to some of his more traditionalist beliefs, as well as his idea that the ideal society would be informed by God and not man, one might view him as a reactionary conservative. On the other hand, Lewis writes explicitly against fascism, colonialism, and even, to a certain extent, white supremacy. By reading the Space Trilogy in isolation from his other writings, it's very possible to accidentally extrapolate a far more revolutionary vision of the man. The truth is, Lewis was neither of these things. That's not to say he was a centrist. He certainly wasn't on the fence about any issues. His beliefs were very clear-cut and defined and influenced every aspect of his writing. In general, Lewis did hold some ideas that were rather progressive in its time. He saw things like colonialism, racial discrimination, and eugenics as morally reprehensible. However, when it came for advocating for actual political action and policy, he tended to favor maintaining the status quo. He was supportive of the monarchy. He didn't like everything the monarchy did. He was Celtic after all, but he certainly did not favor any sort of revolt against the crown. When reading his memoir, Surprised by Joy, we get a more nuanced image of this. Lewis talks about his time in the army during the First World War, and we see a bit of the thought process behind his enlistment. Meanwhile, on the continent, the unskilled butchery of the First German War went on. As it did so, and as I began to foresee that it would probably last till I reached military age, I was compelled to make a decision which the law had taken out of the hands of English boys of my own age. For in Ireland, we had no conscription. I did not much plume myself even then for deciding to serve, but I did feel that the decision absolved me from taking any further notice of the war. Later he says, accordingly, I put the war on one side to a degree which some people will think shameful and some incredible. Others will call it a flight from reality. I maintain that it was rather a treaty with reality, the fixing of a frontier. I said to my country, in effect, you shall have me on a certain date, not before. I will die in your wars if need be, but till then I shall live my own life. You may have my body, but not my mind. I will take part in battles, but not read about them. Whether or not I personally think that this is an appropriate reaction to enlistment or an appropriate reason even, it's besides the point. I think it really highlights Lewis's thought process behind a lot of his other political ideas. He's not exactly patriotic, but he does care about the people around him enough to do his part, so to speak. But his part is limited to maintaining the status quo. Not necessarily doing the bare minimum, but activism super wasn't his thing. Later in his life, he would write, give addresses when invited, and respond to letters from readers, but he wasn't the sort to engage in any action beyond what would be considered respectable. And of course, there is the matter of gender, because while one of our protagonists is a woman, there is some criticism to be made about her presence in the novel. So Jane is almost explicitly the main character. Mark exists primarily so we can see what's going on at Nice and the fact that they're fascist, and so Lewis can have an opportunity to do some political commentary and set up an interesting plot. But Jane is, in this sense, the main character. She has visions of things both in the future and things that are currently happening in a different place. That's very main character energy of her. Lewis could have chosen to have Jane be secondary and have her be seen through the eyes of Ransom, but he didn't. We get to see Jane's first impression of Ransom, and it almost feels like meeting him again for the first time, especially since a lot of time has passed between the last book and this one, and he's a very different person from when we last saw him. The point is, Jane is the protagonist. She's the main character, but she's not really much more than that. She's kind of flat. And I know sometimes people will say that about a character without really justifying it. They'll just say, this character didn't do enough things, so they are flat. I do think, though, that it's interesting to note that despite Jane being the protagonist, she struggles to claim the same level of personality as any of the main characters in the novel. The nice people are crazy and evil in all uniquely appalling ways. McPhee is almost frustratingly fixated on proof via observation. Merlin is assertive and speaks with conviction, but isn't that receptive to feedback when people try to explain to him that his perception of the world as it stands is incomplete. Ransom is, dare I say, sexy and cool. Even Mark, for all his faults, has faults that are identifiable. There's a scene where Jane asks Ransom for some advice regarding her marriage, and there's this really weird bit where Ransom talks about how equality in marriage isn't the most important thing. It comes off very odd, because for one, I don't love that, and I don't super agree, but two, Ransom takes on a bit of a rebuking tone, but there's not really any sort of specific trait of Jane's that he's addressing. It's a very weird scene tonally. It's almost as if Lewis just wanted to worm in his idea on what marriage should look like. But I do think it really exposes the fact that while Jane is the protagonist, she's not given the same agency as the other characters. She exists because of the role she plays in the plot. She has visions and things happen around them. Now, I will say, Lewis didn't maintain his weird stance on women forever. When looking at some of his later work as he develops as both a writer and a person, he does start to do a bit better job of treating women characters like characters as opposed to women. And even later in his life, his wife, who had a very strong personality he seemed to appreciate, clearly impacted how he wrote. One of his later fiction works, the novel Till We Have Faces, is a beautiful retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. It's written from the perspective of a woman, Psyche's oldest sister. Previously in his fiction, Lewis wrote a lot in a third-person narrator voice. The voice is distinctly his, and sometimes he even addresses the audience directly. But generally, he stuck to some level of third person. Here, Lewis puts himself in the shoes of a woman who endures so much pain. She's an unreliable narrator, she's overprotective, she's vindictive at times, she can be very cruel to those around her. But Lewis still writes her in a way that the audience can empathize with her. Some of her actions are difficult to accept. They're easily identifiable as wrong, but we understand them. She is the epitome, in my opinion, of a dynamic protagonist. She's not necessarily the good guy, but the story centers around her. She has what feels like agency, despite growing up in a very restrictive situation. We feel her pains, cry her tears, and love her loves. All this to say that when I criticize the way Lewis writes women in That Hideous Strength and the Space Trilogy as a whole, I am doing just that. There are 11 years between the publishing of That Hideous Strength and Till We Have Faces, and oh my, what an 11 years those were. I think that Lewis wrote his female characters in a way that reflects dated and misogynistic views on women. But I think it would be false to call him a misogynist, or at the very least to say that he hated women. Because once he got a chance to actually interact with a woman who matched him in intellect and cheekiness, he was able to clearly rethink his personal snobberies. And we were able to get some absolutely beautiful writing out of that. Okay, so that's the Space Trilogy. To summarize, Book 1 functions as a solid breakdown and critique of colonialist ideology. Book 2 proposes a spiritual alternative to physical and mental transhumanism. Book 3 paints a very distinct picture of what the growth of a fascist regime looks like and gives us a fuller picture of the way Lewis understands and views politics. And in the Space Trilogy, Lewis has a tendency to allow his misogynistic assumptions about women to shape how he writes his female characters, which generally weakens his writing and his messaging. So what do we do with all this? I think firstly, it's really important to understand how all of these things work together in order to affect the audience. For example, while I would be very hesitant to say that Lewis hates women, I definitely feel that the way he writes them in this trilogy is misogynistic, and I think it's important to keep that in mind when discussing the series. If someone, especially a woman, says they don't like it because it's misogynistic, that's perfectly valid, and it's okay for that to be a deal breaker for them. It isn't one for me, but it's important not to try and make people be comfortable consuming misogynistic content because they're allowed to not enjoy that. If someone were to tell me I didn't like the Space Trilogy because it felt a bit sexist, the appropriate response, in my opinion, would be something like, hey, that's completely fair. For me, I was able to enjoy it outside of that, but I understand why you might not be comfortable with that. And then maybe I would suggest that they try reading Till We Have Faces because it's a lot better about giving women characters agency, and also it's kind of criminal that I haven't heard of it until this year, and so now I have to convince everyone I know to go read it. Read the book, guys. It's a good book. It's freaking awesome. Woo! Basically, have empathy, be normal, don't be a jerk. Studying literature can get kind of funky when it comes to things like misogyny, and I think it's possible to suggest people give literature that may not hold up to modern standards a bit of a chance without invalidating their feelings about that. In addition, I think it's really important to consider what this trilogy and its political implications say about the time period they were written in. Concerns with colonialism and colonist ideology is not some new trendy thing, and it's not even exclusive to leftism or secularism. Here we have a traditionalist Christian who was openly speaking out against colonialism, eugenics, and even to some degree white supremacy in a time when those ideas were really popular and commonplace. It's easy to get this idea that because there has been social progress in the last 30 years, everyone from before that time thought a certain way. There's this idea of this person was from a different time, and everyone was racist, sexist, etc. back then. And while racism and sexism were certainly normalized in the past, especially in the 30s and 40s, it's important to remember that it doesn't mean everyone was the same. That's something I've really picked up while studying literature in the past couple of years, and I think it's really important for more people to understand. It goes back again to the idea of chronological snobbery. Just because racism and sexism used to be embedded into society in a more direct and visible way does not mean that people were all more racist. It means that the people in power were successful in preventing the many people in opposition from touching any sort of legal change. This is an idea that I've been thinking about a lot, and I might do a deep dive about it in the future, more specifically with regards to American literature. But for now, just remember, time is messy, it's bendy, it's weird, and so are people. So when we look into the past, sometimes we just need to accept that not everything is going to line up with how we expect it to. And sometimes we might be pleasantly surprised by some of the ideas that we unearth. Anyway, that's the video. I love you. I'll kiss you. Anyway, that's it pretty much. I know it's kind of a lot, but I had fun, and I hope you did too.